Now then, you're very welcome back. We are turning to a story that we haven't covered overly on the show over the last number of years, but probably one that you're very aware of, the Ash Dieback crisis. Now, Arthur outside wrote a piece about all this for the 42 recently, and it was something that he wanted to follow up on, that we wanted to follow up on. The Ash Dieback crisis on these shores really started in 2012 when it first arrived on these shores. It's incredibly stark. It is predicted, frankly, that 90% of the ash trees on this island will die, and there is simply nothing that can be done about it in the short term. So 90% plus of the ash trees on this island are dying or will die. We think of ash, we think of hurling, which has been affected and is part of this story, and that's the sporting link here, of course. But ash is a native tree to Ireland. It's one of the most common trees in Irish hedgerow. And so this is a very profound issue for the country on a whole host of levels. We're very happy to talk to Ger Buckley. Ger is an ash planter from Tipperary, and he joins us on the line now. Ger, you're very welcome. Good to talk to you.
Thank you, Joe. Nice to be with you.
No, it's lovely to have you. We might just give the backstory here for people very briefly, because I wasn't overly aware of it myself. If we go back to the 1980s, I was born in the 80s. So I just assumed there were always lots of trees in Ireland, here, there and everywhere. But you go back to the 1980s and Ireland had the lowest number of trees in Europe, second lowest in Europe behind Iceland. And so there was work to be done, and the government set about doing that work. They wanted to reduce the reliance on imported wood. And, it's interesting, even in the forestry bill of 1988, Senator Michael Ferris at the time, he said of the current situation as it was in the late 80s, "It's a disgrace that a country, the sponsor of the magnificent game of hurling, is faced with the dilemma of importing ash to make hurleys. It's ridiculous." So for a host of reasons, the government wanted to do something about this, and they incentivised farmers and landowners to, in effect, start plantations, to plant various trees. I'm not sure when exactly, but somewhere around that time, Ger, you looked at this proposal and figured it was a good one for you, and so you went down the route of being an ash planter.
Yes, my wife and I looked at it over 30 years ago, and we planted ash on a number of different sites. In fact, we have about 14 hectares of ash in total.
And what was the thinking behind the decision? Obviously, the incentives, was it like, there's a nice pension for us, or the money? Did the money come up front, or was it across the lifespan, or was it when the ash reached maturity?
No, the incentive was to plant the forest, look after the environment, and in the process establish a form of pension, long-term pension. And of course, the procedure of the schemes at the time were grant aided, so you were assisted in terms of the cost of planting the woodland. Then you had maintenance for a period of 4 years, and there was a premium paid depending on whether you were a farmer or a registered farmer or just ordinary person. And we were farmers, so we got a premium paid on the site for 20 years, as did every other farmer, of course. And then you're on your own after that. So the expectation was when you reach that point in time, you would recover some wood as firewood, and then leading on possibly to, hurley butts as it matured, and ultimately to, mature ash trees that could be used for making furniture, chairs, tables, etc., etc. And therein was the cash cow.
Okay.
And if you got that far.
If you got that far, yeah, which is where we are today. And was your sense, Ger, anecdotally or otherwise, was this a popular scheme? Did it attract a lot of people?
Well, according to the department's own figures, there are over 6,500 owners with ash plantations, and there's approximately 26,000 hectares of ash forest now, not roadside trees, but ash forest planted. So it was planted specifically on foot of the scheme that the department put forward at the time. In addition to other planting as well, we have commercial plantations of spruce also. But certainly the ash was heralded as something that was necessary, something that everybody wanted, and when we were all for it.
Okay, so I guess things were going well until 2012. Ash dieback arrives in the country. Dieback is not specific to the ash tree, by the way. It stems the name dieback from the way the branches die and retreat when water and nutrients are closed off. But in the case of ash dieback arrived in 2012. It didn't arrive on the wind. It seems it was imported wood, which was contaminated, because, you know, in the interim, waiting for all these trees that you and others planted, you know, hurls in Ireland were still being made from, for instance, you know, imported wood, because it takes the guts of 30 plus years for these trees to mature. Was Ash Dieback, can you remember, Ger, pre-2012, was this like something that was always talked about? Like, is this like, God, you know, we fear a pandemic? Was like, were you always on the lookout for dieback? Was it a well-publicised possibility?
No, it was an unheard of disease. When we went into this, nobody had ever heard of Ash Dieback or anything of the sort. And just, if I can correct you, the Ash Dieback is a spore that's airborne. It lands on the leaves and it starts to attack the tree from the leaves down through the stem. But when the tree then is unable to absorb nutrients from the ground, it starts a second process of butt rot. So it's actually rotting from both sides.
Right. Okay. So the tree doesn't have much chance by the sounds of things.
Well, as you just said in your introduction, almost every tree in the country will die as a consequence of this disease. Those in the ash forest plantations will die rapidly because there's such a vast number of them all together. And then those on the roadsides, and you just need to drive along any road at the moment and you'll see ash trees are dying everywhere.
It's fascinating you say that, Ger. I drive roadsides and look, I'm probably listening to a podcast and not paying attention. What should I be looking out for to see these trees die? And I mean, how stark and visible is it for us driving around the country?
Well, normally, if you're driving along at this time of the year, every tree, you know, whether it's ash or beech or oak or whatever it might be, hawthorn or whatever, they're all in bloom and they'll be flush with green leaves. If you look at the ash trees specifically, you'll see a stem with branches that have possibly a small percentage of leaves still on the tree, and you'll find many will have nothing because they're already dead. So essentially, you'll be able to identify the ash tree by virtue of its growth status on the roadside.
And our roadsides are lined with ash. Presumably, it's a native tree. It's numerous. This you know, whenever this really takes hold in a visible way, we will be under no illusions.
Absolutely not. And it also represents significant danger in so much as when these trees are dead or even dying, they're prone to collapse either in wind or just with natural, death. They'll just fall over. So where you're walking on the road or driving on the road, there's a great possibility that either a tree can fall down on top of you or that you can come around a bend and smash into a tree that's just after falling down. So it's an extremely, extremely dangerous disease, and that's also true in the ash forests. You know, those of us who have ash forests, if you walk through the forest which has dieback, there's a distinct possibility that either a tree itself will fall down or one of the limbs on the tree will fall off while you're walking through the forest, and it could come down top of you and give you a very big headache. It could actually kill you, to be honest.
As I mentioned, the Ash Dieback first arrived on Irish shores in 2012. How quickly has it spread? How devastating has it been thus far? What is the timeline in all this, Ger?
My understanding was it was identified initially in Leitrim on young plants that were brought in, I believe, from Denmark. Now, ordinarily, any plant that would be imported would go through a procedure whereby they would confirm the photosanitary aspects of the plant. But these seem to have come in and were planted not only in Leitrim but elsewhere. And once the disease became apparent, as I said, it's an airborne spore, so therefore it was carried in the wind. And the minute it got into the ash plantations, numerous, which throughout the country, I mean, 26,000 hectares is a lot of ash plantations throughout the country. And there are pockets where the ash is, intense, like in Tipperary, Cork, Limerick, Clare. There are significant pockets of ash in those areas because that type of ground was ideal for growth of ash. And so the disease spread rapidly. We first noticed, the Forest Service acknowledged that the disease was present and sent out some circulars advising owners that if you identified this, you had an obligation to report it. And that was part and parcel of the obligation of maintaining your forest according to the Forest Service standards. So we first noticed Ash Dieback on our plantation in March of 2018, and we reported it. There was a scheme at the time which set the standard for a tree of, I think was 10 meters high. And if you were outside of that, it didn't matter. You couldn't report it because it wasn't part of the scheme. So we reported in March of 2018. And ever since then, for the last 5 years, we have been back and forth to the Forest Service with different applications. There was several reconstitution underplanting schemes. We went back and forth. We applied for them. Then the first one was suspended. I think 4 or 7 million had been spent on removing the young ash plantations, and then they realized that that wasn't working, so they introduced another scheme, a reconstitution and underplanting. That was suspended. Its replacement was suspended, and then we entered into this huge debate as to this problem on the whole, because it was then evident that it was across the entire country and doing significant damage to the forests. So recently, as you know, the minister announced a scheme that, well, there were several initiatives along the way. We had Project Woodland, which didn't address the Ash Dieback issue, but then there was a specific report requested by the minister on the issue of Ash Dieback. That was submitted in last year, and that report made several recommendations. It categorized the Ash Dieback problem as a national emergency. This is how serious the authors of that report were in terms of defining what impact this had. That report made several recommendations, and then the minister said, well, okay, she'd have her officials look at it. They now seem to have looked at it, and they've come out with a scheme, the most recent scheme, which was announced on the 30th of April, basically saying that, now we have a solution to the problem. And that all sounds very good, but when you actually dig down into the solution that they proposed, it's not a solution at all. It's a Band-Aid on a big problem, and the problem is not going to go away. So it's a very serious matter for anybody who has an ash plantation, and indeed for anybody walking the road with an ash tree above on top.
Excuse me, what is the Band-Aid solution?
Well, the Band-Aid solution is, at the moment, as I mentioned, there was a number of schemes along the way since 2012 with different aspects in terms of grant aid to support the actions that an owner would have to take. We applied and we got 1 of 5 sites approved, on which the removal grant was €1,000 per hectare at the time. Now the removal grant has been increased to €2,000 per hectare. Mm-hmm. And this follows in part several protests from owners, a meeting that we had specifically with the minister in Youghal in September of 2021, where I actually demonstrated to her that the level of the grant was insufficient to cover the costs. Right. I had invoices with me. I showed them to her and said, look, here you are. These are facts. It's undeniable that the grants are not supporting the process that you wanted to support. And they said they would look at it, but they didn't look at it. And the most recent report in this review group, they made recommendations and they declared it a national emergency. And now the minister has come out with this response on Ash Dieback, which is supposedly the solution to the problem. But as I said, it's not really the problem. What it does, in effect, it provides a grant to support the removal at 2,000 a hectare. Okay. It provides a grant for the replacement of the ash tree with other species of tree. It doesn't necessarily have to be ash. There are some considerations. For instance, if the ash plantation is in a special area of conservation, the policy of the department is it must be replaced by a broadleaf. So in other words, it would have to be replaced with an oak tree or an alder or something of that sort. Whereas if it's not in an area of special conservation, it could be replaced with a commercial crop of trees such as spruce or northern fir or anything else. So in addition to that, then the last element of the current scheme is that they will pay €5,000 per hectare to owners as a form of compensation, and they categorize it as a climate action performance payment. It's very hard to understand what that is actually, because what we, to be honest, the announcement, which seemed good at the time, it was more of a spin than it was of a truth. And, it was heralded as the solution. Even Minister McConaughey came out and said that, this is now the solution. But in fact, when you look at it, it's not the solution. And the complexity of the issue is such that the package that they've offered is not representing a fair and reasonable solution to the problem. For instance, there is no consideration for the age of the affected plantations. And there's a big difference with whether you have a 2-year-old plantation, a 10-year-old plantation, or a 30-year-old plantation, because the quality of the timber is naturally to be considered. There is no consideration in this for the location of the forest. Some forests are easily accessible, others are not. There's no consideration for the variable costs associated with those complexities, the removal and replacement depending on the site conditions. And of course, the biggest thing of all is there's no consideration for the economic loss to the individual owners, and that is a major issue. Now, one might say these intangibles are very hard to quantify, and they are. So the solution to the intangible would have been the removal grant, the assistance with the replacements of the replacement grant, and the payment of a premium for, as in the past, for a period of 20 years, so in order to enable you to look after the forest and to maintain it and to make sure that you had a good forest over time. That seems to have been the piece that has been forgotten. And that seems to have been replaced with this notional climate action performance payment. And that is €5,000 per hectare, which incidentally is payable in 3 installments, 2,500 on removal of the ash plantation and successfully re-establishment of another crop. And then 1,250 on the second grant, which is 4 years later after the maintenance period. And then it's 1,250 the following year. So the 5,000 per hectare is payable over a period of 5 years.
Yeah, okay. So there's a one-size-all aspect to this, which is imperfect and probably unfair on a host of levels. Ger, can I get a sense from you of the speed at which Ash Dieback is spreading and killing these trees? So, for instance, in a forest which is densely populated, from when Ash Dieback first appears in one tree to numerous trees catching it and dying, how quickly is that process? How quickly is all this happening around us?
Well, as I mentioned, we first reported Ash Dieback on our sites in 2018.
Yeah.
I could show you the condition of that forest. I have photographs of that time, and it was just broadly evident. I could take you or even show you photographs of that same forest today and take you back there and show you the trees actually down on the ground that have fallen over because they're already dead.
Right. So
in the space of 5 years, the Ash Dieback has done extraordinary damage to the forest. And of course, it's not just the disease itself. There are weather conditions, wind blow, etc. So the moment the tree loses its capacity to stay alive, any significant wind, and suddenly it's gone. It's fallen over. So it is it is very detrimental, and it's very, very fast. It's very quick. Now, it will not be as evident in a mature forest or on the hedgerows. Even though you'll see the tree is dead, it won't fall down as quick because it has a huge, the tree itself is very large and the root structure is very big. Mm. So it's a very rapidly moving disease, and it infects the trees very quickly, and it kills the trees also very, very quickly.
Okay. I mentioned at the outset, it's predicted 90% of ash trees to be eliminated. I didn't have a timeline on that. When do you think we might hit 90%?
Well, again, there is a thought in Chagas amongst the scientists that there is a percentage of the trees that will have a genetic structure that will reject this disease. And they're hoping that they'll be able to breed, take seedlings from those trees and breed a continuous ash tree that would resist the disease going forward. Now, it will take, years and years. I would say to reach that point in time, we're talking 20, 30 years maybe before we would have some sort of a seedling plantation, if it were to work at all. Now, how quickly do I think it will affect the forest overall? I would imagine in the space of the next 5 or 6 years, depending again on weather conditions, if we continue to have severe storms as we've seen recently, and rain as we've seen since last July nonstop, the forests will actually deteriorate rapidly, and I would imagine that most of the ash plantations will be completely destroyed in the next, I would say, 10 years, absolutely totally destroyed. And meanwhile, along the way, the roadside trees will start to drop one by one, depending on the extent of the exposure and the wind, et cetera, et cetera. So I would imagine in the next 10 or 15 years, we won't see an ash tree anywhere. That's my personal opinion based on the experience I have from since we reported in 2018 to where we are now.
That is stark prospect, to say the least.
Now, maybe the scientists will differ with me. That's just a layman's opinion. But it's based on my personal experience.
Yeah, and look, you have plenty of it. Ger Buckley is with us if you're just tuning in. He's an ash planter in Tipperary and was part of that scheme in the 80s whereby the planting of ash trees was incentivised, and Ash Dieback arrived on these shores in 2012 and has had a devastating effect. Quite obviously, hurling's not the most important aspect here, but it is an aspect, and we saw hurling mentioned back in the 80s when these plans were first mooted, and ash is so almost profoundly perfectly suited to making a hurl. Hard wood, perfect level of flexibility, kind of malleable enough that it can be altered to suit a hurler's preferences. So ash across Europe is under threat. So where do you think hurling is going to be over the next couple of decades?
The disease is evident everywhere across Europe. I mean, it was imported from Europe to Ireland. If we had imposed the right kind of sanitary controls, maybe we wouldn't have this problem, but the department obviously failed in that endeavour. Where will it leave us with hurleys? Most of the hurley manufacturers, in fact, even some of them have gone out of business as a consequence. Connolly's and I think Canning's up in Galway are gone.
Yeah.
Others are under pressure, but Tortleys in Clare have developed a hurley using bamboo. So they are looking for an alternative. The game will not be allowed, disappear. But it's unfortunate that it won't be the clash of the ash anymore. It'll be a clash of something made from something different.
Yes.
And some of the senior players today are using those hurleys, and they seem to be reasonably happy with the the reaction of the stick when it hits the ball, or the clash of the hurleys when they strike. And it seems to be a possible solution to the hurley problem. But that again is, it's just one manufacturer, and I don't know if they're in a position to produce enough to meet the requirements of the nation in terms of all the teams that are out there. Every village and every town has a club.
And as I understand it, that's kind of, it's quite an industrial process, the bamboo-led hurls. It's a composite of different trees. It's not necessarily like a piece of bamboo is taken and shaped a la the ash. So that traditional hurley maker will be obsolete.
Oh, absolutely. It'll be a pure industrial process that will generate something that looks like an ash hurley, but isn't an ash hurley. And it's a composite, probably glued product of bamboo, fibre actually compressed and made into the shape of a hurley. So it's not going to be a traditional ash stick, that's for sure.
A final one, Ger. It's kind of almost rude not to ask. I presume 2012 when this first arrived, and you had gone with the scheme, and it was a quasi kind of pension, and it's just blown up so completely, and the compensation package clearly isn't what you might have hoped for. What effect has all this had on you and on your family and the stress of it all?
Well, look, we're pretty resilient, and we have tolerated this nonsense for the last several years. I mean, we have been back and forth with the department and the Forest Service on numerous occasions about this. And every time, when we initially identified this, the scheme was cancelled, an alternate scheme was introduced. We applied for that. That was suspended. And then to try to deal with this problem, we tried to address it through what was called the Woodland Improvement Scheme. And we got approval for that, subject to a license, but we never got the license. So this continued, and then we got into another scheme, which we applied for. And then that was all under consideration until now, when we have this most recent scheme. And in fact, I have to put my hand up and say that we have already taken out about 4 hectares of ash under that scheme. And we're waiting now for, the requisite payments, et cetera, But the impact is significant in so much as the potential financial loss, well, the actual financial loss is very significant. The value of the wood, the value of the timber at maturity would be, and that's completely ignored in the whole process of this replacement of this new scheme. And from a mental perspective, I suppose, I tore my hair out several times wondering, are they ever going to try to address this, and in what manner, and are they listening to anybody? I mean, this scheme even was announced by the minister without consulting the task force on Ash Dieback, which she established only a couple of months ago. So she came out, announced this thing without even having consulted the people whom she appointed to offer advice in relation to it. So, it's a complete, there's a complete disconnect. And indeed, several politicians, I might say, TDs and senators have come out and strongly suggested that this is not the solution to the problem. But again, nobody seems to be wanting to answer it. And one have to ask, is the announcement of this scheme an election ploy? Because, it's just announced at a very particular point in time when we have local elections and we have European elections. And it's not necessarily, it is spin. And the one-size-fits-all, as you said earlier, it doesn't actually solve the problem. Now, I would ask one question in relation to the whole scheme. This climate action performance payment, which they seem to suggest is the method of compensating the loss on the side of the owner. Minister McConaughey came out and said that it's not possible to provide an annual payment for the re-establishment according to the department's plan of action on Ash Dieback. But if they're able to create this scheme, this climate action performance payment, and pay 5,000 in 3 installments over a period of 5 years, why aren't they able to extend that over the period of 20 years and pay a premium as they would if the forest was planted today new? There's also aspects of the scheme. For instance, if the forest that you have on the ground is 10 years old and dying from the Ash Dieback, technically you're still entitled to premium for the following 10 years. So they're saying that anybody who has a forest that's 10 years old will get paid premiums for dead ash for the next 10 years, and then look towards compensating or coming into the scheme. So the considerations in this are absolutely ridiculous, in my opinion.
Okay.
They should have looked at it in a very, very different way, and they should have consulted the task force that they established, and they didn't. And here we are, we still haven't the solution to the problem, a viable solution to the problem. We have something that people have to sign up to. And in fact, they're forcing people to sign up to it now. They're saying if you don't sign up to this, you're getting nothing.
Another thought, I suppose, is you've planted these trees from young age, well over 30 years ago. They're beautiful trees. Obviously, there's a financial motivation and component to them, and ultimately they would be used and cut down. At the same time, to watch them just die like these beautiful trees that have been in your life for 20, 30 years must be upsetting as well. There must be that aspect to the whole process. There's something so stark about dead trees and thousands of them.
Look, it's very distressing to walk into the forest and see the trees just decaying before your eyes. It is extremely distressing, because when you planted this, you planted it with the best intentions to have good environmental practice, to have a crop at the end of the day that would yield some benefit, and you also have had an obligation to maintain it. So you've been going around, trimming these trees, guiding them to grow straight, all these things that you've done over time, and suddenly now it's all dying around you. It is an extraordinary thing to just watch the forest decay in front of your eyes. It's extraordinary.
Yeah,
As well as
having nurtured it. You're talking nurturing there, really caring for them.
Yes, and I think anybody who has planted a forest has an obligation, a duty to actually maintain the forest to the Forest Service standards. So you can't just plant a tree and walk away from it and go back 100 years later and say that's grand. There is an obligation, there's a duty on you to do certain things over time. And there's a duty on the inspectorate within the Forest Service to come out and ensure that you're doing that. And some of your payments are actually contingent on you having done it. So they will tell you what to do. You do it, they'll inspect it, and they'll confirm it, and you'll get paid. So it's not just a matter of sticking a tree in the ground, taking all the money and running away.
Yeah, there's an emotional component to it. Yeah.
It is very, very distressing to see the forest actually, disintegrating before your eyes. Now, one might say, okay, eventually you'll clear it, you'll put in something else, and 30 years later, again, it'll look like a forest, but I won't be there to see that, I don't know who will, but I won't.
Yeah.
Possibly not, anyway. And that is the distressing point. Like, I love to walk through the forest. For me, it's almost therapy. It's therapeutic to walk in the forest, to take the dog, walk off through the forest, enjoy the sounds, enjoy the birds, watch the wildlife. I have deer, I have hare, I have badger, I have fox, I have everything that you could imagine that you'd want to see on the land.
Yeah.
And it's just falling apart.
Yeah, Ger, I'm very sorry. It's just a desperate situation. Thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about it. Ger Buckley, who's obviously been an ash grower in Tipperary for the last number of decades. Thanks a million, Ger. Appreciate it.
No problem, Joe. You're welcome. And I hope we can find a better solution to this than what they have put on the table right now.